I am the Ascended Master, Jesus Christ. We have talked about the 4 levels, your 4 lower bodies, and how the fallen beings attempt to block your Christ discernment at those levels by pulling you into various vortexes, various reactionary patterns. But why are they able to do this? Well, they are able to do it, of course, because you have the beam in your own eye. You have some unresolved psychology, as is perfectly natural on the spiritual path. We have talked about levels of the path. We have talked about 144 levels of consciousness. And it's clear that when you first find the spiritual path, whatever level that may be in this embodiment, then you cannot grasp the initiations, the illusions at the higher levels. You cannot see too far beyond the level you are at. So once you learn to have some recognition of what the fallen beings are trying to do from without in order to sabotage your Christ discernment, you then need to start looking at what are the inner conditions that make you vulnerable to this manipulation. And this, of course, means you need to start looking at your psychology. Now, here is where we need to make a certain distinction. I know that many of you who have followed this dispensation for some time have already cleared this hurdle. But still, I want to put it out there for those who might find this teaching without having followed this dispensation for a long time. Now, I have said some time ago that we of the Ascended Masters can be compared to used car salesmen who use the bait and switch technique. We advertise a very cheap car, and once you are in the store, we try to sell you a more expensive model. In other words, in order to get you to even look at our teachings, we need to give you something that appeals to you at your present level of consciousness, whatever that level is at. And then once you have started studying the teachings, we need to get you onto the higher levels of the path where you really start making the serious progress that characterizes a person who is putting on personal Christhood. And so when you look at the spiritual New Age community at large, you see that people are at different levels of consciousness that have different focus. They have different ideas and expectations about what they will get out of following the spiritual path. So there comes that point where in order to move further with your Christ discernment, you need to consider, what is my motivation for following the spiritual path? Why did I start it? Why have I followed it to this point? What have I been expecting to get out of it? Perhaps you have never even thought about this consciously. Most spiritual students don't. They find the spiritual movement, that teaching resonates with something in them, and they are not consciously aware that it's because that movement makes the promise that they can fulfill whatever expectation they have of the spiritual path. In other words, what will the spiritual path do for them? And the movement or teaching that resonates with them has something that promises that it can fulfill that expectation. So this is very important for you to step back and consider, what is your expectation of the spiritual path? Now, the vast majority of people, and those of you who have followed this dispensation for some time, will be able to look back to when you first became aware of the spiritual path and recognize this in yourself. The vast majority of people have a clear expectation that following the spiritual path will do something for them, will give them something they want or need here on earth. There is some advantage that they will get out of following the path that relates to their life here on earth. and how they would like their life to unfold. Now, there is nothing wrong with this. It's inevitable that you will feel this way, especially considering those of you who have grown up in a non-spiritual society, whether it be a religious or a non-religious society. You all have been brought up, have been programmed to focus very much on life in the physical universe. The fallen beings have, for millennia, been trying to program humankind to focus on life in this world, first of all. Of course, religions offer you a way out of life in this world, supposedly that you will be saved after this lifetime. But since this happens after this lifetime, it is not something that most religious people spend a lot of time thinking about, what the requirements are for entering the kingdom of heaven, or however they define it. They are again focused on what can their religion do for them in their life here on earth. And so when you look at spiritual people in general, you see that they have many different expectations of what the spiritual path will do for them. Some, for example, expect that they will be able to heal physical illnesses. Some expect that they will be able to manifest lots of money to buy whatever they desire. Some expect that they will attain peace of mind and be able to live a peaceful life, perhaps in a secluded monastic setting. Some expect almost the opposite, that they will have power to go out into the world and have an impact on society and other people. There are many of these expectations. They take many different forms individually. And as I said, there is nothing wrong with this. You have to start where you are at in consciousness. And it's logical that when you are ready to start a spiritual path at the 48th level of consciousness, you are more open to a real spiritual path on growth in consciousness, you will have these expectations and they will follow you until the 96th level. But there comes a point where you need to start looking at these expectations. And you need to then start considering, what will it require for you to follow Christ? Now, if we go back to my life 2,000 years ago, you will see, if you read between the lines, that what I was actually talking about with my disciples and people in general was the path of Christhood. Following Christ means that you follow a teacher who has a higher level of Christhood than yourself, and thereby you gradually put on your Christhood. So you can actually look at some of the words that I said back then, and you can see that I was talking about the fact that you need to be willing to lose your life in order to follow Christ. You need to not be attached to mammon. You need to let the dead bury their dead. In other words, there comes a point where in order to follow Christ, you have to give up something. And what it really means is that for a time on the spiritual path, from the 48th to the 96th level, you can maintain the illusion that the spiritual path is about you accomplishing something in your life here on earth. And I'm not saying that following the spiritual path will not accomplish something for you. But what I'm saying is that between the 48th and the 96th level, you can maintain the illusion that the primary driving force for you following the spiritual path is that you expect that you will attain some benefit relating to your life in the physical universe. Now, as you get nearer to the 96th level, you need to deal with this expectation, because it will not take you beyond the 96th level. There comes a point where you have to start recognizing that the real goal of the path is not to attain some temporary advantage in this world. The real goal of the path is to achieve eternal life beyond this world. And this is a very different matter than the way most people look at the path when they start. It's very different from the way most religious people look at salvation or the concepts of entering heaven, however they define it in different religions. There comes that point where you need to recognize here that the higher levels of Christhood, the more conscious levels of Christhood, will require you to leave things behind. In fact, in order to step onto these higher levels of Christhood, you need to go through a phase where you leave one thing after another behind. You give up a certain sense of life, a certain expectation, a certain viewpoint. And one of the things you have to give up is your expectations of how following the path is going to benefit you here on earth. That is why you need to look at these expectations you have about what the spiritual path will do for you. What will you get out of it? So if you expect, for example, that you will be able to manifest unlimited riches, there comes a point where you need to look at this and ask yourself why you feel you need unlimited riches, what it is you expect that you can do with it, what is the feeling you can get from it. And then you need to begin to question, well, even if I had unlimited amounts of money, would that necessarily give me the feeling that I'm seeking? You can then look at many rich people who have more money than they could ever spend for the rest of his lifetime. How are they feeling? What is their psychological state? Most of them feel not at ease. They do not feel at peace because they are concerned about either making more money, even though they don't need it, or they are concerned about not losing the money they have. So they are still in a state of tension. They are not in a state of peace. They are not using the money they have to do anything for others, which many spiritual people dream of doing. So you might look at this and you may say, well, surely I could do better because I'm a spiritual person. And you can do better if you step up to a simple realization. What you are seeking, whatever physical change, physical result that you are hoping to attain from walking the spiritual path, the motivating factor behind your search is to produce a certain feeling inside your mind. And the realization you need to step up to is that having these outer conditions will not automatically produce the feeling, because the feeling takes place inside your psyche. And your psyche is not, or at least on the higher levels of Christhood, it is not dependent on external conditions. Your inner feeling, your experience of life, your life experience is determined by what's going on inside your four lower bodies. And therefore, getting all the money you think will produce the inner feeling will not produce that inner feeling. It is only when you work directly with the psyche and do the work of resolving what blocks your inner feeling that you will get that feeling. You may have an expectation that one day you will gain a certain power to go out and impress or convert other people, and this will do some good for the planet and for the cause of the ascended masters. This may be what your outer mind, how your outer mind sees it. But when you look a little deeper, there's a feeling behind this that you are hoping to attain. And that feeling will not be the result of having the outer power. It will only be a result of resolving the elements of your psychology that are blocking the feeling. If it is a higher feeling and not some fear-based feeling. And so there comes that turning point on the spiritual path where you will not go higher until you fully acknowledge that the next phase for you is to focus on the resolution of your psychology. Now, some people come to this realization below the 96th level, but you need to come to it in order to start moving beyond the 96th level. And what does this mean? Well, it means that you have to come to this point where you acknowledge that you need to give up your expectations. The expectations you had when you started the spiritual path, the expectations that might have driven you to make the effort you have made until this point, they all need to be given up. Many spiritual seekers who are, you would say, sincere and applying themselves to a certain teaching or a certain practice are not willing to give up their expectations. They hold on to these expectations and they cannot let them go. Now, why is this? Well, it is simply because of what we have called the primal self. As we have explained at length in our books, Healing the Spiritual Traumas and other in the series, there was a point where you, for the first time, encountered the fallen beings and their unlimited willingness to destroy you as a spiritual being. This shocked you and gave you a deep trauma. And in order to deal with this trauma, so that you could live and still function on this planet, you created a primal self. That primal self has as its primary task to suppress, hide the pain of your original, what we have called the cosmic birth trauma. And so the primal self is created in reaction to what happened to you here on Earth when you encountered the fallen beings. For a few people, this happened on other planets. But regardless, the first time you encountered the fallen beings and received the shock that here was someone who was completely willing to destroy you, if they could. This gave you an immense pain because you had not even imagined that anyone would want to destroy you, since you are a positive person who is seeking to help everyone and help the planet rise to a higher level. So you had not imagined that anyone could feel threatened by this and therefore would want to destroy you. So here you are encountering this. This gives you a sense of shock, a deep sense of pain. And the fallen beings are always directing some specific accusation of you that you are wrong because of this or that or the next thing. Can be many of these, depending on the outer situation. And so your primal self was created to compensate for the shock, the sense of loss, because in a sense what you lost there was your innocence. And your primal self is therefore designed to compensate. So first of all, hide the loss so you don't go into the pain again, but also to build this expectation that one day you can come back to that state that you lost, that you had before this trauma. You can come back to the state of innocence. But you see, the primal self was created out of the situation. It was not created out of the state of innocence. So your primal self really cannot fathom the state you had before the trauma. It can only deal with the state you had after. So the primal self cannot fathom Christhood. It cannot fathom true innocence, the state of mind you had before. So the primal self defines the goal of what you are supposed to reach. But it is not a true goal. It is not a realistic goal. It is not a valid goal. The primal self also cannot see beyond the level at which it was created, which of course is here on earth. So the primal self cannot fathom Christhood, cannot fathom that it's only by rising above a certain state of consciousness that you attain true peace of mind and recapture your innocence. The primal self can only deal with earth, and therefore it thinks that since there were certain conditions here on earth that caused you to lose your former state, there will be other conditions on earth that can help you regain it. So now the primal self is trapped in this loop of seeking to attain a certain state, a certain condition here on earth, based on the expectation that that condition will then produce a feeling that was not of earth. Your original innocence was something you brought with you before you encountered the fallen beings. It was not produced by conditions on earth. You lost it, not because you actually lost it, but you lost awareness of it because the conscious you was so shocked and it created these separate selves, and now you are inside the separate self looking out through the filter of that separate self. And that's why you cannot see that you have never lost your innocence. You never lost anything. There is nothing you can lose as the pure awareness of the conscious you. Your innocence was the connection to your I am presence. And your connection to your I am presence can never be lost. It can only be covered over by these outer selves, these separate selves. And you cannot see your connection, that you are connected to your I am presence, because you're inside the self looking out. So the only way to recapture your connection to your I am presence is to step outside the self. But in order to step outside the self, you must look at the self. But the primal self cannot fathom this process. It thinks that there were conditions on earth that caused you to lose something. It doesn't know what it really was, but it has some idea of what it was you lost. And so it is trying to help you recapture what you have lost, but it thinks the only way to do it is for you to have certain conditions here on earth. And that is why when you first encounter the spiritual path, in whatever form it is, an ascended master teaching or something else, your primal self has the expectation that by following this spiritual path, however it's defined, you will gain the ability, the power to change your external circumstances on earth so that they will produce the inner condition that the primal self sees as the goal. But first of all, the condition that the primal self can see is not a realistic condition. And the real thing you need to recapture is your connection to your I am presence, and that is beyond this earth, and therefore it cannot be produced by any conditions on earth. You may look at many, many people who have used some spiritual movement to withdraw from society and live in a more secluded setting where they are shielded from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. And you might see that many of them may have spent decades in such a setting, engaging in various rigorous practices. But very, very few have actually attained the progress that they dream of attaining. And why is that? Because most of the spiritual teachings and practices found on earth promise you an automatic result. that promise you that by following a teaching, by following an outer practice, you will reach your goal without looking at your psychology. Please take note of that sentence. Most spiritual teachings promise you that you can reach whatever goal you desire to reach without looking at your psychology. Now, we have given these very profound and very detailed teachings about the primal self and other separate selves that followed from it. And the essence of this teaching is simple. The separate self, primal self, or other separate selves, they always project that there is some problem that has to be solved, some condition that has to be reached. But the reality is that this is an illusion. But as long as you believe that there is something you have to do, or something you have to attain, or something you have to solve, you are trapped in that self. Now, the real key to going beyond Christ discernment for a certain level is to resolve the primal self. But you cannot do this as long as you are trying to solve the problem that the primal self defines, or that defines the primal self, we might say. You need to come to that point where you, as the conscious you, step outside the primal self, look at it and say, is this a real problem? Can it even be solved? Even if it could be solved, what would I achieve from solving it? And then you realize, you experience the reality that it is not a real problem, and you would attain nothing from solving it. And at that point, you can separate yourself from this self, and you can, as we have given you the practice or the procedure for doing, you can let it die. Instead of trying to solve the problem, you just let it die. In other words, what these cells are projecting at you, and what the fallen beings are projecting at you as well, is that once you solve this outer problem, you will have attained the inner state you long for. What we are telling you is that you will never attain the inner state you long for until you give up trying to solve the problem, trying to produce the outer condition. You let it go. You let the self die. You're not trying to solve anything, compensate for anything, achieve any state. You're just letting the self die. Look back at my saying. What is that to thee? Follow thou me. What this saying really tells you is that there comes many points on the spiritual path where you are facing a certain initiation, a certain illusion. And the illusion is that there's something you have to do, something you have to solve. But what you really have to do is to realize that this comes from a certain separate self. And instead of trying to solve anything, you give up trying to solve anything. You just let the self die. Because you recognize that following Christ is more important to you than producing this outer condition here on earth. Now let me reach back to what I said about the election in the United States. If you look neutrally at many of the people who claim to be following Trump, you will see that they are very emotional about this. They are very attached to Trump and the image that he has projected. What they are really attached to is the feeling that he has given them. And they have come to believe that the only way to have this feeling is through Trump and him being the president, being the leader. So they're very attached. But what are these people trying to do? They are trying to produce a feeling. But they are trying to do it through some outer condition on earth. And now they are facing the possibility that this outer condition will change and Trump will no longer be president. How do you become free of this? Only by realizing that there is something more that is more important to you than producing this outer condition. If you're an Ascended Master student and you have believed in Trump, how can you move on now that he is going to be out of office? Well, only by being willing to say, what is that to me? I will follow Christ. You realize that rising to a higher level of Christ discernment is more important to you than any outer condition, whether this or that person is president. Your Christhood does not depend on who is president of the United States. If you think it does, you are not really understanding what Christhood is. So study my many teachings on Christhood. And so recognize here that how do you move on from this situation? Only by letting go of something. Only by recognizing that the feeling you desire cannot be produced by outer conditions, but only by working directly with your psychology. This is what the teachings of the Ascended Masters through this dispensation are all about. Now, you may have come to a point where you're not willing to apply those teachings, and that is your choice. Then go in peace, or don't go in peace if that's what you desire. But we cannot help those who are not willing to let go of something. And I'm just using this as one example, but there are, of course, numerous examples. You look at spiritual people in general, you look at Ascended Master students in previous dispensations, or even in this dispensation, and you see so many who came to a certain point where here was something they were not willing to let go of. And they either left the path, or they went on to the left-handed path, the outer path, where they refused to deal with something in their psychology. They refused to let go of something in order to follow Christ. They couldn't say, what is that to me? I will follow Jesus. I will follow Christ. Because they actually said, like the young man who came to me and said, I want to follow you, Jesus, but can I go and bury my dead father first? In other words, there was something in this world he had to do before he could follow Christ. And then you cannot follow Christ, because there will always be something in this world you have to do. What did I say to this young man? Let the dead bury their dead. Let those who are trapped in the death consciousness deal with all of the issues they think they have to deal with. You can refuse to deal with all these issues and just let it go and walk with Christ to a higher level of the path. But of course, why is it people can't do this? Well, it is because they haven't looked at the primal self, which thinks that it needs to produce a certain feeling by producing specific conditions here on earth. This is, we might say, the illusion of the ages. It is the one secret, if there is a secret, about the spiritual path. It is a secret because there's hardly any teaching out there that truly reveals it in plain and straightforward language. This is partly because, realistically speaking, raising the collective consciousness on earth is a slow and gradual process. And there is no point in giving a teaching until there's a certain number of people who are ready to embrace and apply the teaching. But nevertheless, the fact of the matter is What does it mean that people are not ready to apply the teaching? Well, it means that they are not willing to look at themselves, to look at the beam in their own eye. So many Christians claim to be my devout followers, but have not been willing to look at the statements I made, including to look for the beam in your own eye instead of judging other people based on seeing the splinter in their eye. And this is truly one of the things that you have to give up, one of the more difficult things to give up in order to rise above the 96th level. You see, the fallen beings have they are a very clear example of this particular state of consciousness, where you are refusing to look at yourself, the beam in your own eye. You are only focused on looking for the splinter in the eyes of others and always pointing out that splinter, always directing outwards that the problem is out there, that other people are at fault, that it's other people that need to change. The fallen beings are trapped in this state of consciousness, cannot go beyond it until they eventually turn around, but even then, they will take them a long time to get beyond it. They have created on this planet a very, very strong collective beast that seeks to pull all people into this state of consciousness. You're always judging other people. You see so many examples of it where you are appointing a scapegoat that is the cause of your problems, and you believe that if you can just get rid of the scapegoat or change the scapegoat, then you will have solved the problem. The problem will go away as if by magic. And so this is a very, very strong collective beast. And again, it's totally understandable, it's completely natural that when you first find the teachings of the Ascended Masters, you are affected by this because you grew up in an environment, and I say this regardless of where you grew up on Earth, with very, very few exceptions, that had its own standard for judging people. There was a norm, there was a standard. This is normal behavior. This is how we behave in Denmark. This is how Danish people are. This is how American people are. This is how the French are. This is how the Germans are. This is how the British are, and so forth and so on. Every nation has this. There is a norm for how you are supposed to be as a good person, and you are brought up to judge yourself and other people based on this norm. Are you living up to it, or are you not living up to it? And then there are various pressures and measures that are applied to those who do not live up to the norm. So it's completely unavoidable that when you find the teachings of the Ascended Masters, you have this in your four lower bodies. You have selves that are created in response to this, perhaps over many lifetimes, most likely over many lifetimes, and those selves are constantly evaluating yourself, constantly evaluating other people, what's happening in the world, and they are judging everything. So what happens when you find an Ascended Master teaching that talks about Christhood and Christ discernment? Well, these selves will literally go, hooray, here is the promised land. Because if we can just attain Christhood and Christ discernment, then we will have the absolute standard for judging other people. There is a psychological mechanism that is found in most people who are spiritual people. You have grown up in a society that was most likely dominated by a particular religion, or perhaps dominated by the religion of scientific materialism. So you have always felt that you couldn't really be a materialist and you couldn't commit to the dominant religion of your society. So you have always felt like an outcast. You have always felt you were being judged by the religious people and by the materialists, perhaps by the communists, depending on where you grew up. But you felt you were an outsider. You were being judged because you couldn't just follow the norm. So in order to deal with this, you have in childhood, most likely also in past lives, created these selves. And these selves have a desire to compensate for you being judged. And they do this by striving to attain this impression, this belief that even though you were judged by those others, the others were wrong and you were right after all, because you are a spiritual person. And it was right of you to be a spiritual person. And here is now an ascended master teaching that validates that it was right for you to be a spiritual person. And it's inevitable that these selves will then start to use the ascended master teaching to judge other people. These people do not believe in this particular idea, therefore they are wrong. They don't believe in reincarnation, therefore they are wrong. They don't believe in this, they don't believe in that the ascended masters teach. Therefore they have a lower state of consciousness than I have. Now again, I'm not blaming anyone for this. I had it myself when I was at lower levels of the path, not in my last embodiment, but in previous embodiments. We have all gone through it. It's just part of the path. But what happens to some spiritual people, some ascended master students even, is that they cannot distance themselves from this. They cannot identify in themselves that they have this separate self, these separate selves that wants to judge everything. And that these selves are using an ascended master teaching to set up what they claim is an ultimate standard for judging other people. This is something you see throughout the world. It's part of what we might call the human condition. You are ignoring the beam in your own eye, looking for the splinter in the eyes of others, and you are judging them very harshly according to what you think is some absolute standard. The thing is, most spiritual people, and many ascended master students certainly, have an expectation that it's possible to create a spiritual community that is based on love and kindness. So you have this intuitive sense that it's possible to have a spiritual community where there isn't judgment. So many people have the expectation that when they find an ascended master teaching, those who are following that teaching should not be judgmental. They should be kind, they should be loving, they should be supporting each other. And it's understandable that you have this expectation, but it's not realistic. This messenger, many years ago, learned about the Summit Lighthouse while he was living in Denmark. He, of course, built up a certain expectation of what it would be to be in the Summit Lighthouse and how people would be in the Summit Lighthouse based on being from a distance, seeing it from a distance, seeing the ideal of the teachings and thinking that everybody who was in that teaching would be as loving and kind person. When he then came to the headquarters of his Summit Lighthouse in Montana in 1987, he was rather shocked. And after having been there for 3 days, like the 3 days in hell that I supposedly encountered in the scriptures, he sat down one day and had to make a decision. Either he had to run away or he had to find a way to deal with being there. And the thought that came to him, which he was able to recognize with his outer mind, was, but wait a minute. When I walked through the gate, there wasn't a big trash can there with a sign saying, leave your ego here. So obviously I didn't leave my ego at the door. And if I didn't leave my ego at the door, then probably all other people didn't leave it either. And so that means that people here still have egos, and I still have my ego. So maybe it was my expectation that was unrealistic. Maybe it was unrealistic to expect that all people who walked through that door would suddenly become perfect people, and that I myself would become perfect by walking through the door. And so this was the very thought that allowed him to stay in the community and make the tremendous progress that he made during those 10 years where he lived there. And it was similar thoughts that enabled many other people. But there were people who didn't have this realization. They found other ways to deal with it, and they started judging, or they continued judging other people, and of course judging themselves without realizing it. And that is why you see that in the Summit Lighthouse they had, certainly at the time, but even still today, a very judgmental culture, where they were using the teachings of the Ascended Masters to create some ideal for how the perfect Chela of the Ascended Masters should be. And they were then judging each other based on whether they lived up to these outer requirements. Are you on staff? Which department are you in on staff? Do you give enough decrees? Are you a communicant? Do you give money to the church? Do you live in Glastonbury? All of these outer things. What kind of car do you drive? What color is it? What color clothes are you wearing? What are you eating? What diet are you on? And all of these things. What is behind this tendency to judge? It's the thought that following certain outer rituals and practices will automatically bring you to a state of Christhood. But we have now given you so many teachings that question this illusion, that you should be able to see that there simply comes a point where you will not climb higher in Christhood and Christ discernment until you fully consciously acknowledge and recognize that Christhood is not a product of outer conditions here on earth. Christhood is not a matter of what you have attained, what you have done, what you own, what practices you are performing, how many decrees you have given. This is not what produces Christhood. Christhood is a matter of one thing only. Not what you have acquired, but what you have given up, what you have surrendered, what you have let go of. How many separate selves have you let go of? How many illusions have you let go of? How many expectations have you let go of? How many times have you confronted an expectation, an attachment, and said to yourself, and truly meant it, what is that to me? I will follow thee. That is the only key to Christhood. You can be a member of a spiritual organization. You can follow its practices religiously, for years and decades. And we have seen this any number of times. But you are still not making progress towards Christhood precisely because you are not making the switch of realizing what Christhood is about. It is not a matter of holding on to things on earth. It is not a matter of perfecting things on earth. It is a matter of letting go. And so many spiritual students, when they find the spiritual path, they become very focused on this concept of spiritual attainment and certain abilities. Many dream of having supernatural abilities. And unfortunately, my life somewhat fueled that dream because I did perform certain supernatural feats. And so many people think that they have to do the same, or they have to have some kind of attainment, however it's defined in their organization and teaching. So they think that they have to take what they already have and perfect it, make it so good that we of the ascended masters will say, ah, there is a Chela who really has attainment on all 7 rays. He's ready for his ascension. But you see, the real path is not a matter of attaining some ability or even knowledge and understanding. Because the path, the false path, projected by the fallen beings and accepted by many students at a certain level because they can't do anything else, is actually the path of raising up some aspect of the ego, some separate self. And since we are talking Christ discernment, well, you have a very strong separate self when you find the path that has been created over many lifetimes in response to this culture of judgment. So you have a separate self that feels that it has a certain attainment in terms of judging others. Now, this self may even feel that it can follow my admonishment to judge righteous judgment, because it thinks that it is not judging based on some human standard, but on a higher standard. And when you find an ascended master teaching, this self says, here is my chance. I will take this teaching, I will study it vigorously, I will apply it, and I will then I will perfect my ability to judge. And I will attain the highest possible standard for judging, namely Christ discernment. I will be able to judge and as an ascended master judges. And so this self is what many ascended master students have believed, that it is a matter of perfecting this self. And when they are able to have that ultimate state of judgment, then they will have attained Christhood. This is Christhood, they think. But my beloved, this is just a self. It will never enter heaven, no matter how sophisticated of its ability to judge. It will never enter heaven. You will not enter heaven as long as you drag this self with you. It can't fit through the door. How will you enter heaven? Only by letting go of this self. What does this mean? Well, many spiritual students that we have seen, both in this dispensation and in others, have still been trapped in thinking that Christhood is a matter of looking at the world, looking at actions, looking at ideas, looking at certain things that appear, and judging them based on this standard of whether they are right or wrong. What have we said before? What did the fallen beings have to do to screw life up on this planet? They had to project that there is a standard for what should or shouldn't happen. and that you need to evaluate everything based on this value judgment of right and wrong, true and false. So these people think that by taking an ascended master teaching and applying it and studying it, they will perfect this judgmental self so that the self will be able to look at anything that happens on earth and judge, is it right or wrong? Is it Christ or Antichrist? But this is an illusion. And at the 96th level, you need to deal with it if you are to move to higher levels. Otherwise, you will go into this downward spiral of judging and becoming more and more judgmental, while even being convinced sometimes that you are the living Christ who is judging. So let me give you an illustration. Let's say that you are in a busy airport. It's before the corona crisis. It's full of people. They are talking, there's loudspeakers, there's music, there is all kinds of sounds. Now you go in there and you're thinking, it is my job to judge which of all these sounds is of the Christ and which are not. And so what do? You focus your attention on the sound. And you're thinking that by developing your ability to judge the sounds, you're manifesting Christhood. But what's Christhood really? Christhood is not the one who hears the sounds and judges them. Christhood is the one, the Christed being is the one who hears the silence beyond all of the sounds. You may be at the noisiest place on earth, but behind the noise is still silence. For the noise must have space in which it can exist. The space that the Buddha holds for earth. And that space, knowing the silence behind the sounds, that is Christhood. That is ultimate Christ discernment. There is a phase, as I have explained, where you're looking at the physical, the emotional, the mental, the identity level. And you are using your ability to discern between what is an illusion, what is a manipulation, what is a vortex, and all of these things. So at that level, you are still, we might say, judging. You are at least evaluating and analyzing. This is part of Christhood at these beginning levels. But what I'm telling you is that there comes that point where you can step up to the higher levels of Christhood, or you can start going down because you now think that Christhood is about judging. So again, go back to the situation where you're standing in this airport terminal, and there's all the noise, people are walking back and forth. And now you realize that you actually have a pair of these noise-canceling headphones that you are wearing. They are cupped tight over your ears. They have a little button on the side. And if you turn that button, the headphones will cancel out all of the noise. And you will just hear the silence. Well, that is the higher levels of Christhood and Christ discernment. It's that you focus on the silence behind the noise. But what does this mean? It means that you realize that the most important for you is to hear the silence. And how are you going to hear the silence? By taking your attention off the noise. As long as you are focused on all the noises, you cannot hear the silence. And what is the primary thing that pulls you into focusing on the noise. It is this belief that you have to judge which noise is good and bad, which noise is right and wrong. But you come to that point where you recognize that it's no longer important for you to judge which idea, which manifestation, which people are right or wrong. It's more important for you to experience the silence, the Christ mind. And once you begin to experience that silence, which for most people really will not happen in a more common manifestation until they resolve the primal self. Many people have glimpses of the silence before they resolve the primal self, but they are not able to maintain it. So after you resolve the primal self, then you can experience that silence, and suddenly it becomes much more important to you than judging whether this or that person should be president or whatever it is that people are judging. And this is when you then begin to see beyond these outer viewpoints. And it is, as I said, if you can have two Ascended Master students who both believe that they have some Christ discernment, and one is wanting Trump to be president and another is wanting another person to be president. But if they both step up to the higher level of Christhood, they begin to see that it wasn't important anymore to them who is president. There are other things that are more important. For example, one thing that it could be more important is that they reach some kind of unity between them, where they are not divided by who is president or who is not president, where attaining some higher degree of Christ unity is much more important than convincing the other person of who should be president. And so this is an example of how spiritual students can overcome this self that wants to judge everything. And this is the only way that you or anyone else is ever going to be able to create the kind of community that many spiritual people dream of. A community that is based on love, kindness, supporting each other. How can a community be supportive if everybody's going around judging everybody? And how can people stop judging others if they don't look at themselves and look at the self that causes you to judge everything, including yourself? You must deal with that self. You must realize that it's not a matter of achieving this ultimate ability to judge. It's a matter of letting the self die and walking with Christ into the silence. What do you want? Do you want Christhood or do you want human judgment? I have set before you life and death. Choose life if you want to walk further with me. Otherwise, I must leave you behind, and you can walk whatever path you define for yourself, based on your judgmental self of what is right and wrong, what is Christ or Antichrist. This self will judge absolutely anything that questions the existence of and the authority of the self. Be honest with yourself. I have said this before. You claim to be an Ascended Master student. You have spent time studying our teachings. What do you really want? Do you want to make progress? Or do you want validation for this self that will never enter heaven? The judgmental self will look at any teaching that questions it, including the teachings of the Ascended Masters, and it will judge those teachings as not being of the Christ. We have seen groups of people who have convinced themselves and each other that this or that messenger was no longer a messenger because the masters would never say this. They have left this or that organization, gone their separate ways, being absolutely convinced that they knew better than the messenger whether the messenger got an accurate message from the masters or not. But what is really behind it is that they thought, their judgmental selves thought, they knew better than the ascended masters what the ascended masters should say. But if what I say conforms to the judgment of your judgmental self, how can I help you be free of that separate self? Now, the self thinks that when it is perfected in its judgment, it will be able to enter heaven. But I, my beloved, am an ascended master, and I know that that self will never enter heaven, and that you will not enter heaven as long as you are holding on to the self. So the only chance I have of helping you ascend is to help you come to see this self so you will let go of it. But if you allow the self to convince you that when I'm questioning the self, this is not a real ascended master speaking, then you are lost. You are lost to me. I cannot help you. I can only respect your free will and say, one more time this person chose the left-handed path of glorifying some self rather than letting the self die and following Christ. Those of you who do it in this lifetime, I can assure you, you have done it in many past lifetimes. How long will you continue to choose over and over again to follow the separate self instead of following Christ? How many times do you need to have the experience that this doesn't work because you end up back in another embodiment and another embodiment and another embodiment, whereas those who let go of the judgmental self, they end up ascending? What will it take to penetrate the layers of defense that your separate selves have built around the conscious you? What will it take for you? Consider that question. What are the barriers that your separate self have erected so that the conscious you cannot hear me? So that you do not have ears to hear and eyes to see. You cannot experience that there is something beyond these selves. There is silence beyond the noise. There's life beyond death. There is the Christ consciousness beyond what you think is the Christ consciousness, but which is the consciousness of Antichrist, the consciousness of death, the consciousness of Satan. Choose ye this day whether you will follow Christ or Antichrist. I give you complete freedom, for I have now done everything that I can think of doing to help you choose life. And therefore, I let go, because as an ascended master, I have no attachment to whether I can save people or not. But I will, of course, be firm and release the fire in order to help penetrate the defenses that you have around the conscious you. We have said the conscious you is pure awareness. Well, that is a parallel to the silence. Experiencing silence is experiencing pure awareness. It is experiencing that you are more than all of these outer selves. And therefore you can let go of all of them, and you will not die. You will not disappear. Because you are, the conscious you is the original being that descended from heaven. And what did I say? No person can ascend back to heaven save the person that descended from heaven. The conscious you descended in pure awareness without all of these separate selves, and only the conscious you will ascend back. And how will it ascend back? By letting all of the separate selves die, by letting go of all of them. All of them must die for you to have eternal life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. For I am the ascended Master, Jesus Christ. Okay, so question and answers. First question. I'm getting tired of my 9-to-5 job. I'm grateful that my salary allows me to provide for myself and my family, but I'm not liking it anymore. I am frustrated about the fact that I'm stuck at work all day long. I can't do other things such as meditating, saying my decrees, spending time with my family, exploring other careers. The only reason I haven't quit yet is because I'm scared of losing my income. However, I feel like I'm not accomplishing my divine plan through this position. I did the Great Divine Director Novena many times, but I haven't received any insights. What am I doing wrong and how can I fix it? Mother Mary will answer. Well, my beloved, I know this again sounds repetitive, but when you have given a novena to gain direction and you haven't gotten any direction, it's because there's some kind of self that's blocking it. So you need to consider what your attitude is to work in general, to your specific job, what your attitude is to the spiritual path and how you can follow it. Not all people are meant to withdraw from society and live a life where they are constantly meditating or focusing on spiritual goals, especially not at their younger ages. So you need to look at all these things and see what kind of self you have that blocks you from either finding another way to make a living, finding a more interesting career, or finding an alternative. You will find, if you're willing to look at this, that there will be several selves that relate to the concept of work, the concept of earning money. And when you deal with those and let them go, you will have greater clarity of mind. Did any ascended masters embody as famous saints or rulers in the Islamic world? Could a few examples be named? Or did any famous embodied saint or leader ascend other than the Baha'i religion founders? Well, what I'm getting is that there aren't any they really, they're not going to answer the question other than El Moya, Master Moore, was embodied as Akbar the Great. And he didn't ascend after that lifetime, he ascended later. So other than that, I don't get an answer to it. Could the Ascended Masters explain why many religions keep forming in India in ancient and medieval times, including comparatively lesser known ones such as Jainism and Sikhism? Were these influenced by the Ascended Masters? And why is it not happening now, considering the descending spiral of law and order, as well as religious, linguistic, social, economic, and political or gender issues in India? Master Moore. Well, my beloved, India is, of course, a very vast and very complex country. What you saw in past ages in some areas of the world was a proliferation of new religions. Some of them were inspired by the Ascended Masters, at least to some degree. And this was because we attempted to renew the Indian nation from being so stuck in the Hindu spiral, the spiral created by the Hindu religion. And so what you see today is that there are not so many new religious or spiritual movements springing up, because there has actually been a shift in the collective consciousness of India, where there is a certain realization that the primary goal for India right now is not a spiritual renewal, but a practical material renewal. What really needs to happen in India is to overcome poverty. And there is nothing more important, no more important step than the Indian nation can take than to raise the majority of the Indian population out of poverty. This is a necessary phase that India is going through and is engaged in. And until there has been a certain critical level reached in terms of overcoming poverty, there is no point in any religious renewal, because overcoming poverty is the foundation for a spiritual and religious renewal in India. What you have traditionally seen in India is, of course, a very divided society where there was a clear elite of landowners who dominated the majority of the population, who lived in such abject poverty that they had no energy or attention left over to pursue any spiritual goals. You have seen a few people, even some who were born in poor families, who have withdrawn themselves from society, followed a guru, joined a monastery, and therefore have pursued a spiritual path. But this has only been for the select few. And what needs to happen is, of course, that India moves to a position where more and more people among the population can find a true valid spiritual teaching that teaches about a spiritual path to a higher state of consciousness and follow it. And this will not be the Hindu religion, because it is too stuck in tradition and rituals. So there can be other new spiritual movements that spring up, but it simply cannot happen until there's enough people who have been raised out of this poverty where they can really actually follow a spiritual path. So you might say that for India, pursuing material growth is actually a spiritual endeavor. This will not be forever, of course, but at least for the time being. After Ghana attained independence in 1957, ethnic divisions have not been fully resolved, leading to coup d'etats until 1992, when we now have a stable country, one of the examples in Africa. But currently these ethnic and religious divisions have surfaced with the EWE group, who are one of the minorities threatening to break away. Ghana goes to the polls on the 7th of December 2020 to either change or retain the current government. as part of issues of corruption against the government, citizens, especially minority ethnic groups, feel unsafe. How can Ghana resolve her divisions and progress towards the golden age, as an example, in Africa? Do the masters see this possibility in Ghana and Africa as a whole? Mother Mary? Well, as we have said before, the situation on the African continent is very complex. We are given teachings on this, and really, even though some countries are further ahead in the process than others, you still see that there is always these ethnic divisions that go back to the tribal period, where Africa was so divided into many different tribes. You have, of course, seen other parts of the world who also had this tribal phase where small tribes saw themselves as being different from or in opposition to other tribes because they were competing for scarce natural resources. So what you have seen in other parts of the world is that the tribal consciousness can be completely overcome, but it usually takes quite some time, certainly generations. But it is overcome when people realize that they can actually attain a greater material standard of living by working together than by working against each other based on these tribal divisions. Now, the difficulty in all nations is, of course, that there is always a tendency that when a nation moves out of the tribal phase, it can very easily move into the feudal phase, as you saw in the feudal societies of Europe, where you have a power elite that basically enslaves the broad population. And because the parts of the world have moved beyond this phase, there is a pull on Africa to either not go into this phase, as you saw exemplified in the colonial age, or to move through it more quickly than, for example, the European nations did. And so you see here that Africa is being pulled by the rest of the world to move from the tribal phase to a more modern state much more quickly than has been done in any other part of the world. And it's natural and understandable that this will give various problems. It is very difficult for people to move so quickly through these stages. And so there really is no one thing that is like the magic bullet that would help Ghana or other nations in Africa move through this phase. There will be some conflicts, there will be issues that need to be dealt with, and it is something that will take time. It might require certain confrontations, a certain willingness to look at the national mindset, the collective consciousness, and acknowledge the divisions instead of seeking to suppress them. You can create stability by suppressing divisions. This you see in many parts of the world, but it only works for a certain time, and then the divisions will surface again. And unless they are resolved, then the country cannot move forward. And so one of the important factors would be a willingness to acknowledge the divisions, to acknowledge that different people have different issues that are valid issues, and to address them, to discuss them openly in the public forum, and to have the government do whatever it can to address these issues and these divisions. Basically, you need to come to a point where a population begins to see itself as more homogeneous. People begin to be able to see beyond these outer divisions, and they realize that they are all part of the country, and that the country can really only prosper if all people in that country prosper. You look at some of the more affluent nations in the world, such as the European countries in Northern Europe, and you see that they have today a much more homogeneous population, but they didn't always have this. So they have attained this by people gradually over generations coming to see beyond the divisions and accepting that they have a common consciousness, a common national identity. And so this is what can happen in at least some African nations. But you also need to recognize that you have a very difficult to solve problem in Africa because many of the current African nations were created during the colonial age. And this was where the colonial powers from Europe drew boundaries, in some cases in very artificial ways, based on a temporary situation, a temporary balance of power between, say, the Germans and the British. And therefore a line was drawn there, not taking into consideration the history of that area, the various tribal divisions found in that area. So if you were to look at this realistically, some of the boundaries in Africa should actually be redrawn so that you can create more homogeneous populations based on the history of that area. But whether this is even possible or realistic, given the consciousness that you have already built of a certain national consciousness, that is an open question. But it is certainly one of these things that ideally could be considered so that you could look at a certain population living in a certain area and redraw certain boundaries so that they had their own nation and that there weren't any minorities in that nation because they belonged to another nation where they could be more part of the majority. But I realize, of course, that this is a very complex issue, and it is not something that is likely to be addressed in the near future. I have a question about Switzerland. Recently, there was a vote concerning big companies that are domiciled in Switzerland. The initiative suggested that the companies should be held responsible for any violation of human rights abroad and held responsible for environmental damage in other countries. The majority of the people voted yes, which is a great progress, but unfortunately without the majority of the states, which means it was turned down. I realize that there is a big fear in the collective consciousness in Switzerland. Its citizens feel that with moving more towards unity, or for that reason embracing diversity, they will lose something. This is shown in Switzerland not entering the EU with inequality of women in certain areas, and also the attitude towards fugitives or refugees, and many more of these examples. It sometimes feels like an island in the middle of Europe where people believe it is safe, so better not change too much. Sometimes it seems quite strange to me. On the one hand, a very progressive nation with its direct democracy, lots of innovative drive, and on the other hand, these regressive attitudes in some other areas. I appreciate your perspective also about what is the next step for Switzerland to take and how we can bring it about. Saint Germain. Well, Switzerland is certainly a unique nation in the world, and it is partly due to its geographic location where the mountains have various effects. Now, there are some people who will say that mountains are spiritual. You see in India how they revere the Himalayas as the location for many spiritual people, even spiritual communities. And there is a certain reality to it, that this massive rock gives a certain stability in a country. And so this can have certain spiritual aspects where people can withdraw to the mountains and therefore be somewhat isolated from the hustle and bustle of the marketplace in the world and lead a more secluded existence. But you also see that there is a tendency in mountainous areas that people are very conservative, not very progressive and willing to change things. So you see the same thing in Switzerland, and you see also that the mountains in Switzerland are actually acting as a division between different groups of people. The German speaking, the French speaking, the Italian speaking, and so forth and so on. So you see that Switzerland is really not a particularly homogeneous nation. The population has a different mindset in the Italian, the French, and the German-speaking parts, and it goes quite deep. So you could say that you actually have three countries in one that are trying to coexist by ignoring their differences. So the next step that Switzerland could take would be that people would start openly acknowledging the differences, talking about them, and talking about whether they could be resolved in a more unified national consciousness could emerge, or whether these differences are simply so deep that it should be acknowledged that they cannot be resolved. If you look at the more long-term perspective of the Golden Age, I have already talked about how nation states will become obsolete at a certain point. I have talked about there can be certain regions that build a deeper sense of unity, and this could mean that national boundaries get blurred and that even some nations will be split up or disappear. So I know that this is not something that many Swiss people are willing to even consider, but it is nevertheless one of the important steps that Switzerland could take, to have an open debate. Do we actually have a future as one nation, or should we split into three nations that then can divide individually whether they will join Italy, France, or Germany? Or perhaps even find a way to cooperate with Austria. I'm not saying that there is a particular outcome here that needs to happen. What I'm saying is that the debate itself could help the Swiss nation progress, where people could confront some of these questions and issues that they have not so far been willing to confront. What we see in the Swiss nation, not only in the Swiss nation, but certainly in the Swiss nation, is an unwillingness to confront certain issues that are deemed to be too confrontational, too extreme, too difficult to resolve. There is a tendency to ignore issues. And there is especially a tendency to let the different regions have certain differences that really aren't compatible with the national awareness as a whole. Like, for example, the treatment of women in some regions that is far behind what it is in the rest of the nation and in the rest of Europe. This is just one example. And so there needs to be a more open debate about what kind of nation is Switzerland? What is the national identity? Is there really a unified national identity? And is it possible, is it even desirable for us to continue as one country?